Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and that we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where a comparatively young library sits on one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today to celebrate another Scholar Talk. Good morning and welcome. If you haven't been to a Scholar Talk before and this is your first time, very special shout out to you. And of course, a warm welcome to many of our regulars who I can see joining us this morning, including lots of my colleagues from the Fellows Program. My name is Rachel Franks and I coordinate the Fellows here at the State Library of New South Wales, and it is, I think, the best job in the library. We have a very fascinating mix of researchers that work here in the Horn Room, from early career researchers who are just starting out to very experienced hands. We have people who are trying a new field and those who have spent decades invested in a very particular topic. A good example of the latter is Robin Walsh, who has dedicated decades of his scholarly life researching Lachlan Macquarie. Another example of that type of investment is Dr. Patricia Curthoys, who began work on the Rusdens of Maitland, I'm going to say some years ago. I don't think it's my place to articulate just how many years she's been working on this family. And Patricia, as our Australian Religious History Fellow of 2023, dedicated her fellowship to the women of this important family and how those women experienced Anglicanism up in the Hunter. And it's great to have her here this morning to share some of her work today. As always, if you have any questions of Patricia about her research, please use the chat feature in Zoom and I'll be back in a little bit to ask those questions for you. But now, please make Patricia feel welcome. Thanks, Patricia.
Thanks, Rachel. I too wish to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora, on whose unceded land I am today, as well as the Wongal people, also of the Eora, on whose unceded land I live. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous people attending this presentation. I also wish to express my thanks to the Library for awarding me the 2023 Australian Religious History Fellowship. As Rachel has alluded to, I'm very grateful for the opportunity it has given me to work on a project I have been long contemplating. I'm also very grateful to the library staff for their assistance, and particularly to Rachel for her support and encouragement, before, during, and now after my time as a library fellow. I first encountered the Rusdens of Maitland when I was doing my PhD in the early 1990s. My thesis was structured around a locality study of Maitland in the middle decades of the 19th century, and the Rusdens seemed to be everywhere in that society. It was George Keylock Rusden, the Anglican minister at St Peter's, East Maitland, from 1834 to 1859, who I came upon first. But when I discovered the letters of the Rusden family, I discovered that Anne, George's wife, and at least some of their six daughters were also everywhere. I've long wanted to do some further work on them. Being awarded the 2023 Australian Religious History Fellowship has allowed that. That lapse of time has also allowed the project to benefit from subsequent work on the Rusden family. 2 biographies of one of their sons, George William Rusden, as well as the work on the Rusden women by Jude Conway, and more substantially by Paula Jane Byrne. For me, Anne Rusden, her family and friends are the focus of a study of religion, race and gender in mid-19th century Australia. The rich collections of correspondence between and amongst Anne Rusden, her daughters and their friends provide insights into how these women understood their religious identity, their position as white women in a settler colonial society, and the ways in which these identities intersected with each other in their lives. For this presentation, though, I'm going to explore the issue of mortality as experienced and reflected upon by the Rusdens. And I will do this by focusing on a number of letters exchanged between Anne Rusden and several of her daughters in the last few months of 1854. In so doing, I hope to elucidate some understandings of death and disease, both physical and mental, held particularly by Anne Rusden in her multiple and intersecting roles as a mother, a grandmother, and the wife of an Anglican minister in mid-19th century New South Wales. I also hope to suggest the ways in which these collections of correspondence allow for the exploration of other lives and other understandings beyond the Rusdens. In late October and early November 1854, Anne Rusden wrote to two of her daughters, to Sarah Ann, known within the family as Serana, her eldest daughter, who lived at Singleton, northwest of Maitland in the Hunter Valley, and to Rose, her youngest daughter, who was then living in Grafton on the far north coast of New South Wales. The primary purpose of the letters was to inform her daughters of the death of one of her grandchildren, also called Anne, the daughter of Amelia Rusden and her husband Ellis Gilman. She had died in Paris after having contracted measles. Amelia and Ellis had been travelling throughout Europe, leaving some of their 11 children with a Dr. McCartney and his family in Paris. While travelling, they had received a letter from their daughter Anne, in which she wrote, "I have had the measles, but so slightly that Dr. McCartney did not think it necessary to let you know." However, when one and then another of the McCartney's children died after having contracted measles, Ellis, followed by Amelia, returned to Paris, where he found at that stage his own treasures well, but the McCartneys mourning the death of a third child. However, after Amelia and Ellis had been in Paris for a couple of days, Anne began to complain of a slight sore throat. As a Saturday, was damp, it was agreed that she, Anne, should remain in their accommodation while her parents went sightseeing for a few hours. On their return, they found Anne feverish, so gave her some James powders, one of the most ubiquitous patented medicines in Britain in this period. And this is an image of a bottle of James powders from the Royal Museums in Greenwich, which is, and it gives you some idea of what the James powders might have looked like that Amelia and Ellis had in their possession. They also sent for a doctor. By the time the doctor arrived, Anne's pulse was 130. Her condition worsened during the night. On Sunday, Ellis telegraphed for their own doctor in London to come to Paris. But, owing to a delay occasioned by the tide and a misunderstanding about their location, the doctor did not reach Anne until the Tuesday morning. Anne died soon after. Anne Rusden was certain that the loss which Amelia and Ellis had sustained was one in which both her daughters knew too well how to sympathise. Serana and her husband, Helena Scott, had endured the deaths of two babies in the late 1840s, and then the death of their son Walker in England, where he had been sent to continue his schooling in the early 1850s. Rose's first child had been stillborn earlier in 1854. Yet unlike Serana and Helenas, whose son Walker had died far away from them, Amelia and Ellis had had the mournful consolation of receiving the parting breath of their daughter. And the letters written to the Rusdens, informing them of young Anne's death, contained the consolation for them of a detailed description of her final moments. The doctor had asked Anne if she had any message to send, to which she apparently answered, "My love to my brothers and sisters and all friends." By this time, it was reported, her throat was so swollen as to impede her utterance and to cause deafness in one of her ears. Her father, Ellis, then asked if he should pray with her, to which Anne replied yes, repeating the Lord's Prayer after him, most distinctly and with much fervour, to the astonishment of those with her. These were, it was reported, young Anne's last words. Her Saviour's words on her lips and on her heart, wrote Grace, another Rusden daughter, to her sister Suranna. The description of young Anne's death in these letters adhered to the evangelical Protestant model of the good Christian death, which had developed in Britain in the first half of the 19th century. British migrants, such as the Rusdens, brought this ideal to the Australian colonies, whereas Pat Jalland argues it was powerful among the middle and upper classes up to at least the 1870s. According to the ideal, the good death required piety as well as fortitude in the face of physical suffering. It should take place within the home, surrounded by family, and with the dying person making explicit farewells to family members. The last words of the dying were considered to be particularly significant, seen as a revelation of fitness for salvation. Anne Rusden and her daughters in the colony also found consolation in two poems, which Amelia had enclosed with the letter informing them of young Anne's death. God's Acre and Resignation, both by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. They had also been struck by another of Longfellow's poems, The Two Angels, which they had seen in the Illustrated News. Grace made copies of the three poems for both Suranna and Rose. God's Acre begins, "I like that ancient Saxon phrase which calls the burial ground God's Acre. It is just. It consecrates each grave within its walls and breathes a benison that is a blessing for the sleeping dust. God's Acre, yes, that blessed name imparts comfort to those who in the grave have sown the seed that they have garnered in their hearts, their bread of life, alas, no more their own." In the poem, it is a simple reference to the burial ground, the cemetery, as God's Acre, which is seen to bring comfort to the bereaved. The name consecrates the graves and spreads a blessing over them. That comfort is particularly for those mourning the deaths of children. The graves are depicted as containing the seed which should have become their bread of life. In Resignation, Longfellow explored the notion of life after death and the Christian promise of eternal life for children who had died. "There is no death, what seems so is transition. This life of mortal breath is but a suburb of the life Elysian, whose portal we call death. He is not dead, the child of our affection, but gone unto that school where she no longer needs our poor protection, and Christ himself doth rule. In that great cloistered stillness and seclusion, by guardian angels led, safe from temptation, safe from sin's pollution, he lives whom we call dead." The final stanza of the poem, however, reads, "We will be patient and assuage the feeling. We may not wholly stay, by silence sanctifying, not concealing, the grief that must have way." And in so doing, Longfellow acknowledges the difficulty of dealing with the grief felt by parents and other family members on the death of a child. As Linda Pollock argues, familiarity with death did not induce indifference. It could be very difficult for parents and other family members to reconcile their religious beliefs with their sense of loss on the death of a child. Jalland, in her work on Australian ways of death, argues that many parents, including devoutly religious ones, struggled with rationalising the deaths of children as divine judgment. Anne Rusden described, in one of her letters to Rose, the death of young Anne as a trial which it pleased the Almighty to visit our beloved Ellis and Amelia. He saw fit to remove that sweet child from the evil to come. Shall not the Lord of all earth do right? Asked Anne. In another letter to Rose, written at the end of November 1854, just over a month since she had received the news of her granddaughter's death, she wrote, I fear that even in writing about the darling Anne, I have too much spoken of her departure as a misfortune, underlined in the letter, rather than a sorrow, also underlined. For blessed are the dead that die in the Lord. In another letter to Rose, she wrote that sorrow would be selfish, but conceded, as Longfellow had done in his poem Resignation, nature must have its ways. Nature must have its way. The tears will flow. They were not, however, bitter tears, Anne insisted. The death of a child was often interpreted as a message from God in the form of a spiritual trial to purify the parents' souls and to teach the survivors the lesson of submission to God's will. Writing to Rose, Anne Rusden describes young Anne as unspeakably blessed by her death, and that they, her wider family, may be similarly blessed, provided they strive to profit from it. Young Anne's death was a warning to them, the survivors, to remind them of the uncertainty of every earthly bliss. Anne Rusden, having been vouchsafed a long life, felt that she, if anyone, should the more ardently strive to enter in at the straight gate. Measles as a dangerous childhood disease was also present in mid-19th century New South Wales. At the time of young Anne's death from measles in Paris in 1854, the Maitland district was experiencing an epidemic. Anne Rusden hoped that the sweet showers which had recently fallen would clear the air of pestilence. Such outbreaks seem to have recurred every 5 to 6 years in the colony, the incidence of measles peaking in summer. However, it was often more fatal when it struck in midwinter and was associated with coughs and influenza. The presence of measles in Maitland in 1854 coincided with an outbreak of scarlet fever. The incidence of the disease in the 19th century was generally highest among children aged 5 to 15. Although it was more often fatal in children under 5. The combined outbreaks of measles and scarlet fever led Mr. Lavigny, who ran a grammar school for boys in Newcastle, which also provided accommodation, to consider sending all his pupils home. The sweet showers of which Anne Rusden had spoken, from which it was believed the air had benefited, however, made him change his mind. Serana, whose son George attended the school, had understandably been anxious about the situation. Anne sought to reassure herself and others about the safety of Mr. Lavigny's school for her grandson by outlining the human precautions he took with his pupils. Mr. Lavigny seemed, wrote Anne in her letters, prompt in his measures. He was constantly with his pupils when they go out, whether to bathe or to walk or to their sports. He never suffers any intercourse with the town, she wrote, with his house being well situated for his purpose. For Anne, it was a subject no less of wonder than gratitude that no one in her family in New South Wales had succumbed to measles. But, as with the death of children, their gracious exemption from the disease at this time was seen as a spur to righteousness, from which Anne hoped they, as a family, would humbly profit. The families of Margaret King, Carolyn Carpenter, and Carolyn Warner had not been so fortunate during an outbreak of measles earlier in the year. Between the end of April and early June 1854, all 3 girls had contracted measles and died. Margaret, the daughter of the West Maitland bootmaker James King, died on the 30th of April, aged just 2 years and 9 months. Carolyn Carpenter, the only daughter of James Carpenter, of Lydney Park on the Hunter River, was 11 years and 9 months when she died in early May. But Levi and Eliza Warner's daughter, also Caroline, was the youngest of the three girls, being just 7 months and 19 days old when she died at Louth Park in early June. Adults in the Maitland district had also died from measles in the first half of 1854. Ronald Portis had died at home in Morpeth in March after a short but painful illness, aged 28. Mrs. Nichols, the wife of the West Maitland agricultural machine maker Henry Nichols, died in childbirth, which had been complicated by a severe attack of measles towards the end of April, leaving her husband with 6 children to care for, including the newborn baby. Sadly, the child, a daughter, also did not survive, having lingered just 13 days from its birth. The scarlet fever outbreak, however, affected Anne Rusden more directly. The mother of a friend of hers in Newcastle, Jane Stacey, died aged 48 in early November 1854. Jane Stacey had survived the death, also from scarlet fever, of her granddaughter Florence, aged 2 years and 9 months, by but a few days. Florence was the daughter of Anne's friend, Mrs. Lewis. The Lewises were living with her parents, Jane and John Stacey, at the time, in the military barracks at Newcastle, where John was stationed as a doctor. By the end of November, their youngest daughter, Leela, who had been born just 10 months previously, had also died from scarlet fever. The Akehards of West Maitland, William and Sarah, had suffered similarly a couple of months previously. Between the 27th of August and the 13th of September, their 3 young children, Hannah, aged 2 years and 1 month, Harriet, aged 3 years and 6 months, and William, aged just 8 months, all succumbed to scarlet fever, their only and regretted children. More generally, infant deaths in 19th century New South Wales were highest in late summer and early autumn, with babies and small children being afflicted with diseases such as infantile diarrhoea and dysentery. George Walker, however, died of dysentery aged 18 months in early November 1854, after long indisposition and some weeks of anxious waiting for his parents, Thomas and Eliza. They were teachers at the Church of England School in East Maitland, and thus known to Anne Rusden. Whenever any trial is sent to a neighbour, such as Mrs. Walker, wrote Anne to Rose following George's death, I feel it an especial call upon me, who have beloved children at a distance, to strive to give sympathy, if not consolation. Humbly trusting, she added, that my dear distant children may meet with kind friends through the mercy of Him, who is a very present help in trouble. Just over a month later, Robert, the youngest son of Edward Ogg, the postmaster at East Maitland, also died from dysentery, aged 10.5 months. Like George Walker, Robert had not been well for some time, which had caused his parents much anxiety and suspense. Anne Rusden also knew the Oggs as fellow congregants at St. Peter's, East Maitland, where Edward had been appointed a church warden earlier in the year. She visited Mrs. Ogg the day after the funeral, finding her calm and resigned. The only disease children could be effectively protected against in 19th century New South Wales was smallpox, following the development of a vaccination process. One of Anne Rusden's granddaughters, Jane, was staying with them in November 1854 when a local doctor vaccinated her. In 1840, George Gibbs, the Governor of New South Wales, had announced that the smallpox vaccination would be available for free in all the colony's hospitals. In June 1852, Dr. McCartney in West Maitland advertised that he would vaccinate children at his residence each Monday during the season. Just over a year later, similar advertisements appeared in the Maitland Mercury. By October 1853, Dr. McCartney was offering vaccinations every Saturday. A month later, it was announced that vaccinations would be performed on any day of the week in West Maitland, or twice a week, namely on Tuesdays and Fridays from 1 to 2 o'clock at the East Maitland Courthouse. Vaccinations were provided at the public expense, Dr. McCartney having been appointed to administer them by the colonial government. In October 1854, Dr. McCartney was again advertising that he was currently performing vaccinations every day. This had followed an item in the Maitland Mercury a month earlier, remarking on the prevalence of disease during the present season. The alarm within the community had been increased by reports of ships arriving in the colony with decided cases of smallpox. Parents were urged to relieve themselves from anxiety and danger by getting their children vaccinated. It would be wrong, commented the paper, to invite its approach by neglect of so simple a safeguard. Anne Rusden was also cognizant of people within her own family and community who experienced mental ill health. A friend of Rose's, Mrs. Walker, of Newbold Station on the Clarence River, was experiencing depression in the second half of 1854. In the early 19th century, the diagnosis of melancholia became restricted to severe depressive disturbances. Simple melancholia, or melancholia without delusion, came to be recognised as a subtype of the syndrome. It was characterised by a dejected state, accompanied by a distressed preoccupation and a slowing of mental and physical functions. But it was also commonly believed that simple melancholia could worsen into more severe forms, for example, including delusions. Rose's husband, the Reverend Arthur Selwyn, was fairly directive in his advice to Mrs. Walker via Rose. "You must tell her to exercise," he wrote to Rose while she was visiting the Walkers in August 1854. "Tell her the less she does in this climate, the more she will feel the heat." By contrast, Anne, in expressing her sympathy over Mrs. Walker's suffering, declared that it is in vain to tell a person whose spirits sink that they ought not to feel depressed, adding that she agreed with those in thinking it injudicious in the doctor to have told her that her illness was of such a nature as that she could not stand many such, and that he hoped it might be very long before she had another. Even if it were correct, but the experience which I have had myself and witnessed in others convinces me that it is not reasonable, for hardly any two illnesses are alike, and frequently the anticipations of conjecture are totally erroneous. It was only, felt Anne, that if their depression arises from any cause which might be explained, that might tend in some degree to relieve the mind. Later in the same letter, Anne shared part of a poem she repeated to herself. Frequently, she said, when oppressed by feelings of melancholy. "Lord, if dejected I appear, and love is half absorbed in fear, then I know I'm not forgot, for thou art with me, though I see thee not," reflecting that it was not so much the poetry as the good sense of it which comforted her. She suggested it might do likewise for Mrs. Walker. And in a postscript to her letter, Anne reminded Rose of Jeremy Taylor's exhortation. "If we bring into one day's thoughts the will of many, certain and uncertain, what will be and what may never be, our load will be as intolerable as it is unreasonable." She then concluded by quoting Matthew chapter 6, verse 34. "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." Anne sought solace in Christian writings, such as those of Jeremy Taylor. Taylor was a 15th century Church of England clergyman, whose writings, particularly The Rules and Exercises of Holy Living, published in 1650, and The Rules and Exercises of Holy Dying, published the following year, remained popular into the 19th century. This was in part because of his poetic style of writing, which led some to refer to him as the Shakespeare of divines. Holy Living and Holy Dying were, it was said, marked by solemn but vivid rhetoric, elaborate periodic sentences, and careful attention to the music and rhythm of words. It was Taylor's reassuring common sense which seemed to appeal to Anne, such as his musings on Matthew chapter 6, verse 34. He had also written, "If thou have a bundle of thorns in thy lot, there is no need to sit down on it." When Anne felt she was succumbing to self-pity, she reminded herself to count up my numerous blessings, so as not to incur Jeremy Taylor's censure of those who chose to sit down on their little bundle of thorns. It was obviously a sentiment and a phrase which resonated with her, appearing often in her letters to her daughter Rose. As well, in those references, Anne writes of her little bundle or little handful of thorns, even though Taylor did not designate a size to the bundle. This can be seen as an attempt by Anne to further downplay her cares, her thorns, and is always accompanied by an injunction to herself to set upon or about counting up or numbering her blessings. Brooding over the thorns, the disagreeables, resulted in losing all pleasure. Then, just before Christmas 1854, Anne informed her daughter Rose of the drowning death in the Hunter River of 15-year-old Mary Adams. Rose had known her older sisters. The river was a common site of drownings in mid-19th century Maitland. The absence of adult supervision and thus ready assistance if needed, as well as the general lack of swimming ability amongst children, made the river a dangerous place for them. Yet even children whose parents had attempted to safeguard them by having taught them to swim drowned at times. Mary Adams had been at school in Sydney, where she had learned to swim, but had recently returned to Maitland for the Christmas holidays. On her first Saturday afternoon home, she went swimming in the river, despite the fears of her sister Emily, aged 13, who had accompanied her. When it appeared that Mary had been seized with cramp, not being able to swim on, her sister and Mrs. Geelan, who lived nearby, called for help. The only person within hearing, Arthur Thompson, although not being able to swim himself, got into the water as far as he dared, but was unable to reach the sinking girl. It was not until Monday morning that Mary's body was recovered. That Mary had been able to swim, what one would suppose would have been the safeguard, Anne Rusden commented, was perhaps the distraction. It led to more confidence and less caution. The Adams were also Anglicans, members of George Rusden's congregation at St. Peter's, East Maitland. George Rusden visited Anne Adams, Mary's mother, after Mary's body had been recovered, and conducted the funeral service and burial at St. Peter's the same day. Anne Rusden visited her the following day, when Anne Adams bitterly reproached herself for having let her daughters go to the river unaccompanied. Anne Rusden stayed for some time and felt that Mrs. Adams had been, by degrees, soothed with prayer. She had, Anne wrote to Rose, sought consolation with earnest prayer from him who alone can give it, and never denies it to the humble suppliant. From Anne Rusden's perspective, Anne Adams was a humble suppliant, as the wife of a publican, Henry Adams, who held the licence for the Black Horse in East Maitland. In noting to Rose that Anne Adams had reproached herself for having let Mary and Emily go to the river by themselves on that Saturday afternoon, she, Anne, added a comment about the impropriety rather than the danger of the activity. It was certainly repugnant to what Anne described as our feelings, the presumption being that her feelings would have been shared across the family, and the implication that her feelings were superior to those of Anne Adams. The Adams, however, were sufficiently respectable to erect a headstone to Mary in St. Peter's Cemetery, which included the verse, "Readers sure, make Christ thy friend, be always ready for thy end. Therefore repent, make no delay. I in my bloom was snatched away. In Christ alone we can only trust to rise in number with the just. While cliched, it suggests the distress of Mary's parents at the unexpected, accidental death of their young daughter, who was snatched away in her bloom. Yet it also reveals both a fatalistic consciousness of mortality and an acceptance of the uncertainty of this life. Readers were instructed to put their faith in the certainty of the next life, of life beyond the grave. That uncertainty, that fatalistic consciousness of mortality, pervades Anne Rusden's letters to her daughters. Death appears ever present amongst Anne's family. Death appears ever present amongst Anne's family and friends, and in the Maitland community, and perhaps more particularly within her duties as a minister's wife. Life in mid-19th century Maitland seemed characterised by what she termed partings. Such partings served to remind Anne, as they should others, that this is not our abiding place. They should teach us, she wrote to Rose in early 1855, to look more ardently towards heaven, that world where there are no partings. This phrase recurs in her letters. Even more so, heaven was a world where sin and sorrow cannot come, a perpetuity of bliss. Anne Rusden's letters, as we have seen, provide us with material about people beyond the Rusdens in mid-19th century Maitland, and thus can act as an entry point into other lives and other understandings, into that of Mr. Lavigny and his grammar school for boys in Newcastle, into those of the Lewises living in the military barracks at Newcastle with Mrs. Lewis's parents, into those of Thomas and Eliza Walker, teachers at the East Maitland Church of England School, into that of Edward Ogg, the East Maitland postmaster and St. Peter's church warden, as well as Anne Adams and her husband Henry, the publican at the Black Horse, East Maitland. Material which, as E.P. Thompson reminds us, can, in fact he says must, be held up to a satanic light and read backwards if we are to perceive how people, for example, that humble suppliant, Anne Adams, understood mortality following the drowning death of her daughter Mary. But for the moment, Anne Rusden, as a mother, a grandmother, and the wife of a mid-19th century colonial Anglican minister, remains my focus as I have explored her understandings of mortality. These collections of correspondence are rich indeed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patricia. There's quite a lot of death in that particular presentation, but we didn't lose anybody. So while you were listening. So we'll just go through to questions. We do have a couple coming in. So this one's quite specific. So you talked a lot about the criteria for a good death. Lots of rules. I don't know how many people would have actually been able to tick all of those boxes. And then this idea of consolation for the bereaved of God's plan. Was there any sort of open revolution, or at least quite vocal rejection of that, and people declaring at the time, actually, no, this doesn't make sense? Would it have been an issue that people would have left the church over?
Oh, I don't know about that, Rachel, but I do think, and I perhaps don't know more widely, but it struck me as interesting that I think you see in Anne Rusden's letters that her own struggle with the death of Anne and how the death of her grandchild and how she should understand it, and that she berates herself that she feels that perhaps she's talking about it too much. She's dwelling on it too much. She's dwelling on it as a misfortune rather than something which was perhaps designed by God. Although I don't know. It's hard to know. It's hard to know whether people actually believed that, or that was the way in which
that was just an expectation.
Well, that and that the expression of that helped them deal with the death. But I think it's interesting that even Anne Rusden, the wife of an Anglican minister, who's a very who's a mainstream Anglican but a devout one, even she struggles with the way that she is responding to young Anne's death. Mm.
Another question is more about you as a biographer of various people within this family, and specifically how you did meet them for the first time back in the day, and you've come back to them a few times, and just this idea of do you feel towards them like they are family or old friends, or do you come across them while you're doing something else and think, oh, you again? Like you did make that comment at the beginning that this was a family that was absolutely everywhere. So how do you respond when you keep coming across them in the archive?
With delight, Rachel.
Okay.
I I don't consider them as family or friends, but I like them. I have a fondness towards the Rusdens. And as I said, I first encountered George Rusden in the public record in Maitland. He's obviously the Anglican minister at St. Peter's, but he's also incredibly active in Maitland society. He is largely responsible for the establishment of a branch of the new Savings Bank of New South Wales being established in Maitland. He's involved in the Mechanics Institute. He's involved in the hospital committee. When the railway comes to Maitland from Newcastle, he's there to give an address on behalf of the people of Maitland. There's a sense in which he was both capable and highly regarded and reasonably well regarded. But the joy, I think, of discovering the letters is that they then give you evidence that Anne and her daughters were also everywhere. So which you don't get as much sense of their presence from the public record. So, for example, Emily, one of the daughters, acts as Rusden's bank clerk because the branch is actually operated from his house. But two, you certainly get a very vivid sense of Anne's life as the wife of an Anglican minister. In this instance, when people die, but it's not only George who attends to these things, but Anne visits congregants, even if she passes judgment on them at times. And there's other instances of her daughters also visiting bereaved people within the community. And so I think one of the things that I really enjoy about using the letters is that interplay between that record and the public record. And yeah.
Well, it's nice that you still like your subjects. I know a few biographers who are less fond of the focus of their research. I was hoping that we would sort of keep things a little bit more lighthearted, but we do have a very specific question about death and about you. And as an historian immersed long term in this particular topic, which is, quote, burdened by the weight of all the disease and death, and how do you deal with that, managing to retain the energy and focus that you need to have to bring us as an audience these particular insights?
I think it often depends where I am in the research and writing process. So often, if I'm researching a particular aspect, such as childhood disease, one can get, I was going to say excited, but that's not quite the right word. One can be encouraged when Anne Rusden, for example, talks about there's an epidemic of measles in Maitland, and you go to the Maitland Mercury, and there are records of all sorts of people contracting measles, and some of them, dying too. But and and so there's a sense in which you then have a body of evidence to talk about the issue, and as you would know as an author, and then there's that lovely sort of creative process where you work out how you're going to use your examples. It's often when I come to redrafting that I tend to, that I can be more affected by the nature of the subject matter.
I do, just to give people...
Well, it is, yeah.
I did tease Patricia a couple of times in the Mitchell reading room, these huge piles of secondary sources and not a chipper title to be seen. And I was a bit worried that you were trying to outdo me as far as body count for a particular project was concerned. But just still talking about that, but from a really different angle, we have an interesting question that's coming about the availability of the smallpox vaccination. And given that people saw these deaths as God's will, as instructive in some way, and having functions within Christian lives, was there any reluctance to accept science-based preventative measures and then treatments if somebody did fall sick?
I don't really know a lot about the smallpox vaccination, but my sense is that despite the sort of admonitions of in the Maitland Mercury, there didn't seem to be a reluctance amongst people to take up the option of a vaccination, particularly seeing that it was being offered free by the government, and offered in a fairly structured way from 1840 onwards. It's available through colonial hospitals, and then obviously in the 1850s, specific doctors within towns were appointed by the colonial government to administer the vaccination. Anne Rusden, for example, is very pleased when her granddaughter, very pleased that her granddaughter happens to be with them when there's a possibility of vaccination. There's a bit of concern about whether she might have a reaction to it, but but she doesn't. And yeah, so there doesn't seem to be any reluctance on Anne's part to adopt these measures. And considering that it's about the only thing you can do, you know, yeah.
And that would have
Yes,
been
sorry, and I think, you know, again, that probably, well, you know, that to some extent that suggests that tension between understanding death as God's will, but actually making other sorts of decisions within your life to avoid it if possible.
because that would have been quite a statement for such an overtly religious family with, you know, leadership positions within the church to be, you know, supporting vaccination in that way. That's really interesting.
Well, although, as I said, the Rusdens are fairly mainstream Anglicans. They're all interested in science. George is interested in science. Anne is interested in science. The daughters are interested in science. That's another thing that besides reading Jeremy Taylor, and making sure you don't sit down on your little bundle of thorns, or choose not to sit down on your little bundle of thorns. They also read science. They also read science publications and discuss those things. So there's no sense in which they're anti-science. Yeah.
And that's a really neat segue into another question that we have. So you've spoken at length today about death and disease pervading the letters of this family. Are there any other dominant themes that you've also identified within this correspondence?
Well, as I said, there's a lot of discussion of religious texts, and often says in her letters to her daughters, "I have been reading this. Have you read this? I think you should read this." And one of the attractive things I think about Anne Rusden and her daughters is that they read these things and then they comment on them and they don't necessarily agree with them, or the bishop comes to and preaches at East Maitland and doesn't necessarily agree with what the bishop has said that Sunday. So there's certainly some independence of thought amongst these women. I mean, I don't think you can make too much of that, but you know, I think you can make something of that. Yeah. So, yeah, and you know, and they you know, there's a lot of talk about sort of other aspects of family life. For example, when they're organising, when the whole family is sort of organising for Sir Anna's son Walker to be sent to England. But it has to be said that you know, death is ever present in the within Anne's life, and I think particularly, you know, as a minister's wife. Yeah.
Now we have time to just squash in one more question, and this is quite broad, so I appreciate that this particular batch of research has been incredibly focused, but someone's just asking more generally what impression you have of religious segregation in the 1800s. So even though they're, as you described, the mainstream Anglicans, are they sort of clustered within a community of other Anglicans? Are they talking to the Roman Catholics? Do they talk to people who have no faith?
Well, well, as I said, Rusden is a very public figure in East Maitland. And so people would know of him even if they weren't members of his congregation. I don't have much sense of him proselytizing beyond his role as a minister. His involvement, for example, in the Mechanics Institute or with the Savings Bank, are not particularly, well, are not motivated by what you might say, what you might think of as specifically religious motivations. I've written elsewhere about George Rusden that it's more that he sees many of these sorts of things as within his province. So what, you know, that as an Anglican minister, as a you know, that these are the sorts of things, as a sort of perhaps as a leader within the community, he should be involved in. And he is not, he doesn't sort of particularly not be involved in things on religious grounds. Yeah.
Because apart from starting a bank in your lounge room, he's actually quite a good example, isn't he, for, you know, being very community minded and doing all sorts of things that might benefit all sorts of people beyond the confines of a very neat congregation.
Yeah, I don't know whether he would see those as either philanthropic or charitable activities, though. That these are just, it's more that he's sort of involved in all of the activities that are happening to establish Maitland society, you know, and those include the Mechanics School of Arts, the Mechanics Institute, the hospital. These are the sorts of things that new societies need, and of course he would be involved in those. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I know it's been an extraordinary amount of labour unpicking this correspondence and following through on those rich themes that you've been working on. And for everybody else who's here today, please join us. Next time, we'll have Emeritus Professor and Merriweather Fellow 2023, Martin Lyons, talking to us. And he's going to be unpacking his research, which drew on autobiographies and other documents found here in the library to investigate the popularity of Shakespeare, Dickens, Scott, and many other writers, specifically to challenge the idea that colonial Australians did not have a strong reading culture. Indeed, we did. So come along and find out all about what we were reading back in colonial times, and maybe draw some parallels to what we read today. So that's Tuesday, the 1st of October at 11 a.m. And you can go to the library's website and you can book for that scholar talk. And you can also book for a very special presentation that will be here on site. You can come and meet fellows in real life on Tuesday at lunchtime for History Week. Nancy Cushing, our Coral Thomas Fellow, will be talking about that often maligned bird, the bin chicken, but more appropriately referred to as the great white ibis. So do come along to that, and potentially anything else that you might see on the library's website. I hope to see you in real life or online soon. Until then, thank you, Patricia, and thank you all for coming. Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.